Thank you everyone for attending the annual Golz lecture. I first want to introduce myself. I am Professor David Gordon and I teach African history here at Bowdoin, although I know many of you. Thank you for attending the Golz lecture. I want to begin by thanking the many people who made the lecture possible, including our department coordinator, Jen Connor. Mr. Ronald Golz established the Alfred E. Golz Lecture Fund in memory of his father. This fund is used to support a lecture by an eminent historian or humanitarian and forms a much anticipated event on the annual calendar of the history department. We are delighted to have Professor Mustafah Dhada, an influential Africanist historian, humanist, and public intellectual in Mozambique and Portugal, and Professor of History at California State University in Bakersfield, to deliver the annual Golz lecture. Mustafah Dhada grew up in Mozambique in the southeast of Africa, then sandwiched between the white supremacist regime of apartheid South Africa and one of the seats of African independence and liberation, Tanzania. As he came of age in the 1960s, the anti-colonial forces of Mozambique, around the leadership of Samora Machel and Eduardo Mondlane, in the Frelimo movement, began to fight a guerrilla war against Portuguese colonialism and fascism. The next part of his biography I'm going to take from his own words in an article that he published in the Portuguese newspaper Público, kind of an equivalent of the New York Times for Portugal. I was a young man when the Wiriyamu massacre arrived at the headlines of the newspapers on the 10th of July in 1973. At 22 years, with a Portuguese passport without a surname, I had arrived in London on the 16th of August in 1972. Poor and only knowing to speak a few words of English, perhaps even poorer than Salazar, the future dictator of Portugal, was when he left his village to go to Coimbra in Portugal at the beginning of the 20th century. But I was determined to succeed. My objective was the University of Oxford. Salazar's objective was to suffocate Portugal with bureaucracy and terror. I like this autobiographical introduction where Professor Dhada presents us with this parallel history, Salazar and Portuguese fascism with its intolerance, its determination to keep people unenlightened, and perhaps most of all to keep the Portuguese empire in place at massive human cost. But the brute Salazar met his match in the gentle Professor Dhada, who, with the determination of a historian, would set his life's mission as bearing witness to the victims of Salazar and his accomplices' violent efforts to defend Portuguese colonialism. From that moment, on the 10th of July 1973, when his native Mozambique made the headlines in his new adopted country, Professor Dhada maintained an interest in the Wiriyamu massacre. In the end, he succeeded in going to the University of Oxford and graduated some 15 years later, after he had first arrived in the United Kingdom, with a PhD in African history and a dissertation on the African nationalist movement in the Portuguese-ruled Guinea-Bissau in West Africa. The anti-colonial movement there was under the leadership of one Amilcar Lopes Cabral, or Amilcar Cabral, who was assassinated just before the independence of his native Guinea and Cape Verde in 1974, but would become known as one of the most influential anti-colonial African nationalists of his time. From his dissertation, Professor Dhada published his first book, Warriors at Work, a trailblazing account of Cabral and his revolutionary movement. He has continued to write about Amilcar Cabral, and at the moment, with funding from the Endangered Archives Project at UCLA, is involved in the salvaging of Cabral's lost recordings still held in Guinea-Bissau. But Professor Dhada would not forget those newspaper headlines of the Wiriyamu massacre, even as they were an inconvenient memory for Portugal after the Carnation Revolution that led to the end of Portuguese fascism and empire in 1974-5. The problem for Professor Dhada were was the sources. The Portuguese military had destroyed or suppressed documentary records or created false ones. So Professor Dhada undertook an oral history campaign to reclaim the memory primarily of the victims of Wiriyamu, but also of anti-colonial combatants and even perpetrators of the massacre. His extensive oral history project held great significance for historical scholarship. Archives or written documents often underpin history. Since the 1970s, many historians have tried to fill in the gaps or the silences in archives with oral history. But what of an event where virtually no documents or archives exist, or alternative fake archives were produced? Professor Dhada gathered a body of oral evidence, of witness testimony that irrefutably established the historical veracity of the Wiriyamu massacre in the absence of archival records. It was a remarkable and groundbreaking historiographic intervention, one of the best examples of oralcy in historical practice. He pioneered the work of what he coined or terms forensic history, where historians use their skills in uncovering evidence to establish the veracity of acts of mass violence. Professor Dhada has now published 2 works on Wiriyamu. The Portuguese Massacre of Wiriyamu in colonial Mozambique, being the first, won the American Historical Association's prize for the most distinguished text in African history in 2017. The genius of Dhada's meticulously researched, multi-layered account is twofold, said the prize jurors. It places the grisly massacre in historical context, expands historical knowledge, and perfects methods to produce a definitive social history of Wiriyamu. And a second book, inspired by the requests of his students, is entitled The Wiriyamu Massacre, an Oral History, which reproduces 29 of the most important interviews and is a gripping read. Professor Dhada's dogged insistence on the forensic gathering of evidence led to the eventual recognition of the Wiriyamu massacre by the Portuguese political elite and its Prime Minister, Antonio Costa, only last year finally admitted and apologized for the massacre. Professor Dhada is now ready to write his final book on Wiriyamu, which I think he's going to speak more about in a moment. But I'd be remiss if I did not also say here at Bowdoin that Professor Dhada is a committed teacher of history. Diversity and inclusive excellence through pedagogy is a core aspect of Professor Dhada's being. He's served in various administrative roles in California State at Bakersfield to inspire student learning. He teaches there as well as in Coimbra, in Portugal, and sometimes in Mozambique. His classes range from early modern European and Middle Eastern history to the history of African liberation to a seminar on why we kill. I'm not sure that Professor Dhada has been able to provide an answer to that question, why we kill, but it's a question that inspires his laborious work as a forensic historian, which for him involves gathering fragments of evidence from the past, what he describes as gluing together shattered pieces of glass through which we can view who we were and perhaps who we might become. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mustafah Dhada to Bowdoin College.
Thank you so very much. Well, allow me a memorial opener. As historians, we dig up primary sources, curate them chronologically on a spatial matrix, and with the ensuing culture of evidence, argue with the past to shed light on a subject matter. We want the scholarly community to recognize the critical merits of our work. Outside the academy, we want our work to help vested interests figure out who they were, their core values, and guided by these, where they stand and whence head next. In a sense, we are humanity's authentic compass for mindful living. Guided by this idea of mindful living, I spent the last 20 years investigating intermittently the Portuguese massacre of Wiriyamu in colonial Mozambique with two objectives in mind. Find a permanent nest for Wiriyamu to live in Luso-African social history and help end Portugal's 50-year disavowal of the Wiriyamu massacre. Last fall, Portugal admitted its army had slaughtered 385 innocent civilians. I am now poised for a new adventure in mindful living. 9 months ago, you reached out to me to talk about my work at this year's Golz Memorial Lecture. Until then, I knew a bit about the scholar, but not about Alfred Golz, in whose memory I am speaking to you tonight. And that is my bad, to quote Satchmo, then 55, Alfred Golz's senior by 10 years. When Satchmo coined the phrase in 1956 on Ed Sullivan's show, I was 5, living as legally uncivilized under the 1954 Colonial Act, Lei Orgânica do Ultramar. I could redeem myself through assimilation, though, that is to say, become a person, in other words, by embracing the Catholic faith, becoming fluent in Portuguese and adopting Portuguese mores, and I quote, as long as I kept outside of anarchic democratic structures, unquote. Outside Bowden, there is extraordinarily little on Alfred Golz. He was born in Rhode Island 3 days after me, but 40 years before me. Unlike me, he lost both parents in his late 20s and died young by today's standards in 1968. He was 57. Today, he resides in 2 places: 765 Prospect Street, Fall River, 182 miles south of here, off Route 24, north of Interstate 195. And every November, he is with us here as a guardian angel of productive scholarship. According to the net postings, the Golz lectures have yielded a bounty of thought-provoking returns for the last 34 years. 15 of these are thematically cogent, of which 1/3 are on mass violence. The lectures cover, among other things, corporate complicity in the Holocaust, collaborations with apartheid South Africa, the transformative role of firearms in Native America, and the corrosive role of rubber in Liberia. And let us not forget the summer fellowships and Adam Hochschild's soul-searing presentation that augmented his other work on the Congo under Leopold II, Belgium's Builder King. My work is modest in comparison, but it has allowed me to lead a mindful life and helped me to do my bit to change for the better a slither of this big wide world. And this is where Alfred resides. With that memorial opener safely tucked away under a cozy, let me share my work with you, if I may. Africa under European occupation, Africa was under European occupation for half a millennium. The Portuguese led the way. Others from Europe followed. Although the Portuguese were the first to land, they were the last to leave. During their stay, they occupied 7% of Africa's landmass, ruling over 17 million multilingual and multi-ethnic people. Portuguese occupation ended after a fight lasting 15 years, during which an estimated 110,000 African civilians perished. We had to fight, said a Portuguese government official. We were there to promote and defend Western civilization. Portugal's record to promote the virtues of the civilized West was not exactly stellar. On the eve of their departure, only 37% in the occupied territories spoke Portuguese, and less than half had converted to Christianity. The record excludes the 5.8 million sent to fuel the plantation economies across the pond. In today's terms, that figure meant emptying Maine of its people once every 125 years, 4 times. One could be forgiven to view Portugal's occupation through a trifocal lens of violence, death, and archival omissions, which enabled Lisbon to commodify Africans, us, pacify resistance, erase African personhood, fight insurgencies, and hide its conduct of war in a veil of silence. Apropos insurgency, one data point stands out quite starkly. The daily average of African civilians killed during the 15-year armed struggle was 20. And the authentic voices of these civilians are seldom heard in Portuguese declassified colonial archives. They are, however, cited as interpolations, as malignancies, or on occasions as digital abstracts. In the context of death tolls, and using reductionist equivalency here, Wiriyamu was carnage on steroids. In other words, 40 days of killing was done in one afternoon. In the broader picture of Portugal's last colonial wars, Wiriyamu was small potatoes, to quote one Portuguese source. It stood for 1/3 of 1% of the total number of civilian casualties. In qualitative terms, however, Wiriyamu proved morally terminal for Lisbon. Wiriyamu was in the district of Tete, which was shaped like a wayward thumb, leaning westwards, 1/3 larger in size than the state of Maine. The Zambezi River sliced Tete in two and cradled Wiriyamu as it headed to the Indian Ocean. Perched on a rock shaped like a seahorse, Wiriyamu was 15.5 miles south of Tete, the provincial capital. North of it was a footpath studded with boabs, which it shared with Shawara, which nested a set of boulders looping around mud huts. A switchback approximately 7 miles long ran along a seasonal creek connecting the banks of River Zambezi to the main highway, which in its own turn linked the city of Tete to Xangara, located 51 miles south near the Luenya River, a tributary of the River Zambezi. The Luenya, the north-south road from Tete, and the River Zambezi formed a triangle. Shawara and Wiriyamu were in the northeast corner of this triangle, with Shawara 3.25 miles northwest of Wiriyamu. The villages of Juau, Wiriyamu proper, and Jumus formed part of the Wiriyamu complex, which included the villages of Riacho, in which several hundred households lived in a semicircular gulch, some 7 to 10 feet below Wiriyamu's first house that framed the entrance to the village. The Vatican is where we begin our story. On Tuesday, May 7, 1940, Portugal's Premier, António Oliveira Salazar, inked a new concordat with Pius XII, granting the Portuguese Catholic Church a monopoly on educating and proselytizing Africans in occupied territories. 3 years later, Lisbon sent Dom Sebastião Soares de Rezende to oversee missionary work in the dioceses of Beira, which covered 63,000 square miles, stretching from Beira to Zobwe in the north, and from Tete city to Uncânia in central West Mozambique. Rezende faced challenges. Portugal was short of priests, and the socioeconomic conditions afflicting his parishioners were dire, not what he expected. To address these, he imported foreign priests conversant in Portuguese and experienced in socially transformative ministries. Among them were the Spanish Burgos fathers, who dominated 5 locations in Tete, all key to this story: Xangara, Matundo, Mucumbura, Tete City, and Uncânia. By 1972, the Burgos fathers had transformed Tete's missions into seminal institutions for progressive thinking on what they thought mattered most to their parishioners: human rights, culture and identity for transformative selfhood, and self-determination broadly defined. Domingo Cansandi, who played a leading role as Wiriyamu massacre's first data collector, was a product of one such institution in Shangara after 1 year to be near, he moved after headed by a charismatic priest called Vincente Beringwe. Cansandi moved to Tete from the Shangara 1 year after to be near his family, while continuing his education at the local parish school by his mentor, Padre Domingos Gonçalo Ferrão, a former protege of Rezende. Ferrão was a lexicographer by training, a proud advocate of Jungue Natividade, and a fierce critic of Portuguese occupation, for which he was tortured and released from prison with a warning: "Stick to preaching, Padre." Cansandi woke up early on that Saturday, December the 16th, 1972, to head to Shangara to visit family, friends, and fiancé. He had 50 miles to cover on foot using back roads to avoid police detection. By nightfall, he had reached Wiriyamu. The carnage was over by then, and most survivors had scattered except for the ones he met on their way south, who told him what had happened. Did so-and-so survive? The interrogatives continued. At one point, he could not keep the tally correct in his head. His informants made a campfire as a source of light for him to jot down a list of the dead on bits of butcher paper. Unbeknownst to them, the Portuguese commander unit that had carried out the massacre had settled for the night nearby to wake up early in search of escapees. Cansandi returned to Tete and handed the list to Ferrão, who collated the data with his own numbers from survivors flooding the hospitals nearby. For the next 2 weeks, Ferrão and Cansandi worked together on the joint list, with Cansandi repeatedly going into Wiriyamu to collect more data and fact-check what they had. In the meantime, the Burgos priests begged for military restraint against their parishioners and asked the church hierarchy to intercede on their behalf, to no avail. "It's time for action," said a Burgos priest from Mucumbura. By January, the Cansandi Ferrão list of victims was ready for global disclosure. Burgos missionaries assumed the authorship of the list to protect Ferrão from another torture stint in prison. One Burgos priest from Mucumbura, ordered by the authorities to leave the mission at once, stuffed the list in his pants. He slipped past police detection as he boarded his flight to Madrid. A similar list was smuggled out a bit later by another Burgos priest from the present-day Shangara mission, as crucial data were missing in the first edition. Wiriyamu's first outing was in Spanish and Italian presses, but did not gain the publicity needed to hold Portugal publicly accountable for the mass violence, not until Father Adrian Hastings persuaded the Times of London to accept the story. On July the 10th, 1973, 206 days after the carnage, the story came out just in time for Portuguese Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano's visit to London. He was expected to arrive in London to celebrate 500 years of Anglo-Portuguese imperial alliance. The Times then fought back the Portuguese denials. "Wiriyamu did not exist," said journalists hired to back up Caetano's claim. "The massacres never happened," Lisbon said. Hastings and Peter Pringle, a journalist of the Sunday Times, insisted Wiriyamu happened. Pringle named one survivor as proof. Once outed, that survivor was whisked away into protective custody by an intrepid priest from Matundo. "I'm a son of a bullfighter, Dhada. We fight." Two Burgos fathers from Tete, Beringwe and Julio Moura, traveled to London to corroborate the published report. Beringway had seen survivors fleeing the carnage to board the bus in which he was traveling, and Moore had helped a foreign journalist contact survivors for the interview. Portuguese denials continued to mount, but the published story took off. It reached the United Nations, which set up a commission of inquiry with offices in key locations in Africa to gather primary evidence. Hastings and Pringle flew to New York to testify. The commission concluded the published texts were correct and the allegations true. The massacres happened as reported and were not an exaggerated tale of woes by priests and their parishioners, as their parishioners, as the Portuguese had claimed. In the face of these UN findings, Portugal vacillated between outright denial and an admission of sorts. Yes, rogue agents have perpetrated perhaps mass violence, and they were being investigated under Portuguese military code. However, Portugal emphasized the massacres were nowhere near the size reported, nor was it reflective of Portuguese conduct of war in territories under their occupation. On April the 25th, 1974, 6 months after the revelations, Caetano's Portugal fell, and Mozambique headed for constitutional independence a year later. Local church leaders then erected an ossuary to commemorate the killings with a glass window left open, displaying human skulls and bones mixed with tibias and goat femurs. Several works document Wiriyamu. Early texts affirming the story rely on the Cansande Ferrão list, and published documents, some primary in nature. Scholarly interest after the revelation continued until the 80s, when its factual presence gave way to works of fiction, which filled the factual gaps left unattended by Hastings and others. Thereafter, Wiriyamu's global presence disappeared, though it continued to surface as one-liners in scholarly works. Similar neglect eroded public memory of the massacre, while the ossuary on site defied the elements despite lack of proper maintenance. In the Iberian world, Wiriyamu fell silent much sooner. We heard nothing of the next 2 decades after the April Revolution. Discourses among veterans and commanders continued as expected split between deniers and redemption seekers, among whom was none other than Antonino Melo, the commander of Operation Massacre. Melo's agony found public expression in the form of a journalistic inquiry, which once published generated the publications of several fictional works. Published texts on the Wiriyamu massacre say extraordinarily little about Operation Massacre. Those that do portray the dead as victims without a voice are silenced prematurely by mass violence. This image effectively devalued human life and worth, making them objects without a provenance, which in turn helped deniers to dismiss Wiriyamu as historically significant, while helping skeptics to tarnish the story's integrity with alternative facts from colonial archives. One such text of doubt and articles was penned by 2 Portuguese scholars in 2012, which was brought to my attention by a colleague of mine from Belfast. I was then putting the final touches to my monograph on Wiriyamu. His note jolted me to a halt. I was forced to reframe my work. The article confirmed Ricoeur's contention, namely, selective memory has the power to extinguish painful pasts in historiography, as does the uncritical use of colonial archives, even if read critically along the grain. My immediate task, therefore, was to craft a cool-headed rebuttal, Yeah, a cool-headed rebuttal. Good God. Forgive me if I'm jumping ahead of my text. A cool-headed rebuttal, essentially, to particular article. The editors, however, proved reluctant to grant me that right, but relented once a board member of the journal, supported by eminent Africanists, intervened on the ground that the norms in the academy granted me such a right, but not the right of a final say. I was fine with that, of course. My rebuttal was measured and focused exclusively on the text. It deconstructed the narrative into 28 key arguments, taking great care to counter the underpinning structures of each evidence-based with evidence-based responses. Upon reflection, omitting Wiriyamu massacre's social history was a tactical error on my part. It left Portugal's denial free to inhabit the epistemic stratosphere and future texts of doubt free to issue false narratives with ideologically tainted facts. Addressing Wiriyamu's social history was therefore important to protect it from future detractors. And this task could not be addressed in the rebuttal article, given the strict word limits imposed by the journal to avoid an avalanche of texts on a single issue, which was clearly beyond the scope of the journal's broader missions, namely cover civil wars from the perspectives of security studies and political science. In a sense, my rebuttal shared the fate of a significant body of literature on mass violence today, in that it memorializes the perished as kismet-driven objects. Things were done to them. The victims did not speak, nor did the survivors on their behalf. Memorializing the horrors of mass violence this way doomed mass violence narratives to live 6 feet under, since for the living, death silences the social past. The two objectives I sought from my work, therefore, required resuscitating Wiriyamu's social history before reconstructing the massacre. Oral research to anchor Wiriyamu's public memory in its social history proved easy to plan, though not as easy to articulate. Briefly, the project collected data through critically mediated survivor testimonies. When the project began, the field of oral history was in its infancy. It has now come on its own, making serious developmental strides in framing rubrics for collecting census and qualitative data in oral historiography. In addition, of the several texts that shaped the project's research on demography, climate, animal husbandry, domestic coal and artisanal productions, a few are worthy of note here. Landeg White's Magomero, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladury's Studies of the French Peasantry and Environmental History, both heavily influenced by the Annales School under Brodel, and Renajit Guha's Subaltern Studies, to which I was exposed directly in my formative years at Sussex. The search for tools to recreate the massacre, however, proved difficult. Perhaps not as difficult and as traumatizing as the final phase of the project, which entailed creating a sanctuary for survivors to relive the massacres and have their reconstruction on record where allowed by informants. The mainstream historical profession proved resoundingly silent on forensic methods to reconstruct the anatomy of mass violence. Cold case methods in criminology and forensic anthropology were not, however. Methodologies in these disciplines helped with data classification and their cross-indexing to cut empirical contradictions, argue with aberrant data to refine the main narrative, and anchor microdata along chronological and spatially proportioned flowcharts. Reenactment on locations by willing participants and volunteers helped pinpoint what happened to whom, who was where, and doing what during the massacres. The use of photo cameras, speedometers, and clinometers proved instrumental for quantitative data collection, as did twine, stakes, and feet as alternative to measuring devices. By the time fieldwork began, a slew of literature became available. Let's get me out of here. Trauma and social suffering, of which helped me develop tools of methods for recording survivor testimonies. These tools were designed to view potential informants as oral archive of human fonds, which posed two challenges, one related to retrieval methods and the other concerning refractions in collected data. While print media remained static and unaffected by how data was organized, retrieved, and used for nurturing cultures of evidence, memorial data was dynamic. Any number of uncontrollable variables had the potential of shifting the memorial location of evidence, affecting in turn their interpretative textures. In other words, oral data collection was dynamically interactive, volatile even, and highly reflexive to methods of retrieval through the interview process. The project findings are clear about the triangle's social life. Wiriyamu started life as a tiny settlement at the turn of the last century under its chief Wiriyamu Sanganimbo. Shawara had similar beginnings. Wiriyamu prospered in the first half of the 20th century, successfully developing animal husbandry. Village traders plied their animals, and vegetable produce grew to feed the settlement. Kindling was collected and the surplus sold. Moonshine flowed as a social lubricant. Surplus alcohol bartered and sold, while several in the community gained the reputation as master brewers. Palm frond artisans occasionally sold their wares at the weekly farmers' market. The triangle enjoyed an abundance of water until climate change forced the people of Wiriyamu to spread out to form 3 satellite villages near water and seasoning streams, João, Jamus, and Riacho. The chieftaincies therefore grew economically apart. One focused on cattle rearing, while Shawara's chiefs sought wealth distribution by controlling access to resources to mitigate the rise of powerful cattle barons. The chief and his deputies marketed their animals by keeping highly productive relations with cattle buyers, many white. The Wiriyamu chieftaincy encouraged growth and relative prosperity among villagers while courting foreign missionaries and Portuguese volunteer militia to attract community schools, water wells, and infirmaries. Both chieftaincies were well-versed in conflict avoidance and mediation. Given their resource dependence on water and trading of domestic animals with outsiders, the triangle had a vibrant spiritual life, revolving around sorcerers, healers, rainmakers, and attended rituals in the sacred virgin forest. People in the village quarreled, danced, were happy on occasions and sad or angry on others, and they fell in and out of love. They welcomed outsiders into their fold, marriages failed too, and marriage counseling headed by village males occasionally stemmed the tide of permanent separation and, in some cases, divorce. Like any other community of this size, Wiriyamu was very different from a rural idyll. It has its share of conflicts, social tensions, discords, and family feuds. The Wiriyamu chieftaincy, however, proved remarkably progressive and resilient to change. It appointed deputies to cope with what appears to have been a healthy demographic growth. Deputies were given considerable executive powers, ranging from the production of moonshine, slaughter and sale of sales of meat, front yard sales, water, and horticultural rights, to construction of holding bays for birthing animals and building pens to hold animals overnight or to protect them from hyenas and other nocturnal predators. The chieftaincy controlled what they called o poder do tocar o butuque, the power to beat the drum, that is to say, call people to assemble for palavers. In addition, it kept social order and minimized conflict through rituals and ceremonies. Similar rituals protected the village from the unwarranted evil and harmful spirits. More complicated rituals still helped invoke rain or restore ecological balance in the community. Marriage alliances between chieftaincies and between families of deputy chiefs formed an intricate and delicately constructed social political network. In a way, the network helped minimize conflict and encourage open lines of communications, with the result that by early 1970s, Wiriyamu blossomed to spread to 3 villages, with Wiriyamu proprio, the village itself, and its communal center. The neighboring villages of Shawara had a similar genesis, though not as pronounced a growth as that of Wiriyamu. Now let me turn to the massacre, and I'm afraid what you're about to hear is somewhat grisly. Field research gives us a clear picture of that day's carnage, which the colonial archives do not give, with bits and pieces missing. On 16th of December 1972, military strategists gathered early at their headquarters in Tete and ordered Antonino Melo, the commander of the 6th Commando Unit, to, quote, go to Wiriyamu and clean it up. The triangle was infested with insurgents, they said. He understood clearly what to do. His company of commandos had conducted numerous such operations. And I quote, normally, we would go into the area e nós limpávamos tudo isso. We cleaned up everything. To save bullets, we shoved people into huts, threw unpinned grenades, shut the door, and boom! The thatched roof would lift, expel hot air, suck in fresh oxygen, and it would come down igniting. Those not killed by the blast died from the fire. They then destroyed granaries, other foodstuffs, and livestock, time allowing. They moved fast to avoid, insurgent ambush. He was also instructed to take with him secret police interrogators, of suspects. Just before noon, a coordination support unit planted red flags around the 5 villages in Wiriyamu. Portuguese Air Force then bombed around the 5 villages in the Wiriyamu Triangle. One gauntlet was left open to catch escapees from the village of João, heading to Mfaramadwe strategic hamlet. 5 helicopters arrived thereafter, one near village of Shawara disgorged a group of interrogators in full army uniform. 2 hovered, one near João and the other near Jamus. Neither landed. The ankle-deep tree stumps stood in the way. In such cases, and I quote, the helicopters would hover, we would jump, land, and run, recalls Merrill. I'm a bit vague on this point. I think that is what happened. Someone called out to California Canivete from the village of João, what is that noise? Nothing. São os militares, dor de cabeça. They are the military expletive, headache. But did you not see this war coming? I asked him and Bulacho Pensado Zambezi, my other interviewee. Canivete said nothing. Bulacho retrieved the silence from unrecorded history. You see, we knew there was war there in the distance. We never thought it would come to us. They were fighting each other, and it has nothing to do with us, he added in not so many words. In Shawara, 2 uniformed interrogators summoned everyone to gather near the chief's house. People then assembled one by one. Why had they refused to move to Mparamadwe as they were told? Chief Shawara replied, they were waiting to have access to water and grazing land for their animals. Mparamadwe was a goat pen. Even the Portuguese acknowledged this. Shawara's erasure then began. The assembled were asked to clap their hands as they were about to die. Pandemonium ensued. Once shooting began. 53 fell. As the rest ran to escape, Chico, a leading secret in a police interrogator, bellowed, Aphani Wense, kill them all, leave no one alive, no witnesses. The soldiers split in 2. One collected bodies in pile, which was then set on fire. The other formed a semicircle to kill escapees. Antonio Michon and the survivor Pringle was to interview later was on the edge of the pile of fallen bodies, unconscious but unhurt. He regained consciousness once the flames crackled from the burning flesh and fat. He made a dash for it. 4 others escaped this pile. 1 bullet hit him on the shoulder. The next day, a close relative of Portuguese militia took him to Tete's hospital to have his shoulder wound looked at. The killings at João and Wiriyamu were a tad less sadistic, and details are Spartan. The commandos had hit the ground running just as the helicopter rose to leave. One eyewitness, hidden behind a clump of tall reeds in a gulch nearby, saw Melo's men unpin grenades into the hut packed with people, while others fired on escapees. João's termination was assuredly swift, clinical, concise, and cold. Of that we can be certain. The killings at Wiriyamu were a bit nuanced, as one of you pointed out this morning. While others ignited huts brimming with people, Melo directed his men to shove the largest group of people into one of the largest huts. The task proved easy since many were already there for a social gathering to celebrate a major occasion that morning. At one point, Melo felt his leg in a tight grip. He looked down and his eyes met hers. A young girl, aged about 10, held him tightly, refusing to budge. He could not pry himself free. Melo ordered his men to retrieve her mother from the hut and told them both to flee. Upon being told that Melo would be interviewed for this project 23 years later, the young girl, now a full-grown woman, requested to convey her thanks to Melo for saving her life. When told this, Melo went peacefully quiet, but sat erect and composed. For tactful reasons, I kept my mouth shut. With several unpinned grenades thrown in, the hut was slammed shut. Inside was Vasco and her sister, both survivors. O que ninguém de gente não podia respirar, said Vasco in Yungwe patois. Lucy translated, we were too many, it was difficult to breathe. His sister was the nearest to the back door, which she pushed open. Melo's men had not noticed the hut had a back door, said Melo. Vasco and her sister made a run for it just as the grenade's blast lifted the thatched roof. There ended the largest carnage of Wiriyamu. With a swift clean-up complete just before sunset, Melo and his men headed to set up camp quite a distance from the site, hunting escapees on the way. Jamusa's cleanup took a bit longer. Chico and Johnny 2 uniformed agents led the interrogation. Where were they hiding the terrorists? Reveal what you know or die. At some point, a helicopter arrived, but hovered around, above ground on the left of the baobab tree that framed Jamus's entrance to pick up the confessors for in-depth interrogation at the police headquarters. And that was the baobab that I was showing in an earlier photo. One informant later reported hearing cries from the torture victims at the interrogation center. No, please, no more. Para, Chico, por amor de Deus. Stop, Chico, for the love of God. By sundown, there was no more confessions to be had. The Portuguese soldiers split in two. One formed a wide gauntlet, while the other group stood in a semicircle to cull escapees from the final kill. Upon instruction, Jamus's people formed a line facing their smoldering huts. They were ordered then to run. Chico was leaning against a baobab tree. 22 years later, I found that tree's root cradling a femur of an unnamed victim awaiting burial. And that's what you saw. The assembled were told to run for their lives again. It is unclear how many escaped. One informant remembers zigzagging straight into a smoke-filled burning hut. He did not feel the heat, he said, and the smoke saved his life. The helicopters left with its human cargo. The soldiers, on the other hand, joined their unit command for the overnight camping to prepare for the next day's hunt, which, according to information provided to Padre Ferrão, spread to as far as Luís, Carneta, Goma, and smaller villages under the chieftaincies of Rego. Data on the 3-day hunt proved hard to reconstruct, except for fragments suggesting an indeterminate number of casualties. The Wiriyamu findings were presented to the scholarly community in the English-speaking world in 2 monographs, one in 2016 and one in 2020. Chapter 9 of Wiriyamu's social history and Chapter 10 on the anatomy of the massacre formed the core of the Red Book. Did the monograph reach its first intended objective? If we take book reviews in scholarly journals as reliable outcome-based indicators, then I venture to say yes. It was recognized as a valuable for the literature as a valuable monograph for advancing the literature in the field. While some reviews highlighted the book's discourse on oral research methods as worthy of note, others saw chapters 1 to 8 in avian terms, preparing readers for a vertical dive into the book's vortex. A more pointed assessment came from 3 jurors reviewing the text for a book prize, and Professor Gordon, cited that. They saw exactly what the dedication intended the monographs to be: a permanent nest for Wiriyamu to live in Luso-African social history. They thought the text to be a meticulously researched, multi-layered account that placed the grisly massacre in historical context. I'm just repeating, the citation you provided, to produce a definitive social history of Wiriyamu. How about the book's other intended objective? And younger historians in the audience, please, I crafted this for you. The answer is Byzantine. Here is a condensed version, and I hope you will forgive the profusion of personal pronouns. The Lisbon-based Tinte de China published the Portuguese edition of the Wiriyamu, of the Red Book, in 2000. Yeah, let's get this out of the way. forget it. The Lisbon-based, Portuguese edition of the Red Book. Normally, I don't do PowerPoints, I'm afraid. This is just such a distraction, to be honest with you. I apologize. I know, it messes up the delivery of the text. I know, Professor Gordon, you are a purist, but there you have it, I'm afraid. Here is a condensed version in okay, there you are. And sent, okay, so this is the bit that I think, is important for the young scholars in the audience. The Lisbon-based Tete de China published the Portuguese edition of the Red Book in 2017 and sent a copy to the Prime Minister's office expecting a response. Yeah. None came. And understandably so. A response contesting the red text would have obliged the government to reveal any classified oral and print media evidence in its possession that were missing from the National Archives. Since silence, therefore, was a three-headed win for Lisbon. Its denial remained undisturbed in status quo ante. It locked up my text in an echo chamber. And it kept scholars, the public, and I guessing what the government had and knew that we did not know from accessible sources. So, and I knew this was coming. In addition, Lisbon could afford to ignore me, the text's author. I was an American, homeless in Portugal, academically speaking, and without a nationally known history as a scholar influencer, a word that they used, and public intellectual. These deficiencies, however, left me undeterred to make a last-ditch effort to dialogue with Lisbon, either directly or through an intermediary. And the intermediary was António Manuel de Oliveira Guterres, the newly elected Secretary General of the United Nations. I approached a well-connected public intellectual in Coimbra to help me with this. Do you think we could get Guterres to put pressure on Lisbon to revisit its denial of the Wiriyamu massacre? Let us wait and see. That was the response I got. I took that to mean, you are on your own here, buddy. With that answer, I knew what I had to do next. Get an academic home, resuscitate my Portuguese citizenship, fast-track my dormant Portuguese language skills, and develop my street cred as a public intellectual in Portugal. I traded my summer teaching and content-based doctoral supervision for a research associateship at Coimbra University, which was Salazar's alma mater. You may recall this is where Salazar had crafted the 1954 Lei Orgânica do Ultramar to civilize us in Portuguese-occupied Africa. Next came setting up a network of historians, social scientists, journalists, public intellectuals, and humanitarians to help me develop a 5-year public information campaign on Wiriyamu and the Luso-African colonial wars. We took extreme care not to overexpose the public to the Wiriyamu massacre. Newspaper articles, opinion pieces, radio and television interviews, podcasts, social media posts, on Facebook and listservs, academic articles and seminars rigorously adhered to evidence-based narratives and eschewed partisanship and polemics. Response to denialists focused on level-headed arguments buttressed by evidence. The aim of this concerted effort was to soften the main target, the movers and shakers in the government. They were urged to consider declassifying materials on the colonial war, legislating procedures for handling public records. For those of us following in the present debate, in Florida, please note. Mandating retroactive collection of public documents in private hands, and setting up a transparency commission with legally enforceable powers to audit aberrant practices in declassification of archival materials and holdings. Harmless demands. I mean, it's nothing political about that. Early last year, the president ordered declassification of colonial materials. Included among them were 70 folders related to Wiriyamu. None appeared tectonically significant to alter the core 2 chapters of the Red Book, and expectedly so for a variety of reasons that I will abstract and essentialize here. The crack in the dike widened last summer when a high-ranking military officer from the Defense Ministry asked for a meeting. Would I consider a text on Wiriyamu to be included in their officially curated volume on Portuguese colonial wars? Yes, of course, I will be happy to write. But you do realize I will be honest and robustly transparent, right? He replied, yes. I then knew something momentous was afoot. A few months later, the Costa-led Lisbon government announced, yes, we did it. We did commit the horrible atrocity in Wiriyamu, killing innocent people, and we apologize for it, or words to that effect. After 50 years of denial, Portugal had nothing materially significant to either back up its claim or to add to the text I wrote. What is interesting here is the number of casualties cited were from the Red Book. All other sources cite anywhere between 200 to 400. With that public admission, the first part of the fight was over. Wiriyamu was an indelible, dark episode in Portuguese colonial history. But what about the rest of the other 109,615 dead? Their story is yet to be told. We can draw, and this is for the younger historians, we can draw one meta-conclusion from this study. History matters. And as far as Wiriyamu is concerned, we now know the 6-hour massacre happened. The death toll was definitively 385 named. The carnage smothered the social life. Wedged between contumacy and conflict, Wiriyamu leaders did their best to stay neutral and alive. Here, neither the skeptics nor the Portuguese archives can help us experience Wiriyamu before its demise, but oral forensic evidence can. By relying exclusively on colonial sources, texts of doubt hovered over Wiriyamu, delegitimizing its life, in other words. In a sense, it is understandable, though not entirely excusable, that skeptics approaching the narrative from above, as it were, lent weight to the contention that the subalterns cannot speak because they don't appear in colonial archives and therefore are technically dead. This perspective, advocating for memorial evidence and the historian's positionality, has implications for the historical profession and the humanities. It urges us to inoculate mass violence narratives with social history as a protection from future denialism. Readers in the sentient world at large can then bear witness to a social experience before its disappearance. In the scheme of things, ladies and gentlemen, death is existentially impossible without a life lived. And once 6 feet under, the dead cannot argue with the past. Those left behind can, by telling us first how the dead lived, loved, laughed, and argued with each other before sharing with us how they perished. This then is the 50-year story of Portugal's denial and the final reckoning of the Wiriyamu massacre.
Thank you very much for that amazing lecture, tour de force. I failed to give you some water. Would you care for
I'll take that. Is that for you?
No, this was for you.
Thank you.
But I do think there are a few minutes for questions, and please come forward. Would you be happy to take a few
of course.
few questions?
I'm sorry. Perhaps I have overshot my mark, but forgive me for if I sort of transgressed my my time framework.
Thank you for that riveting talk, and thank you for your work, more importantly.
Thank you.
I have a question about the reception in Mozambique and how their understanding of the massacre has evolved, and what impact your work had there, and especially on the community where you conducted the oral interviews. If you could say a few words about that, would be great.
Right. And my reply is a bit sort of essentialized or abstracted, because I've been so involved with fighting the demons of empire in Lisbon that I haven't followed it very, very closely, the narrative unfolded. But from the reports that I get, is that it's cited essentially, as finally, the dead can now rest, so to speak, and the reception. So it has been fairly well covered, and I think the net. If you go to the Mozambique-related websites and so forth, listservs and so forth, you get quite often the citations and say, well, this is finally somebody has actually done some work on this. Among intellectuals, and of course also among school teachers and so forth, which is really where legacy building occurs, as you so well know. In Wiriyamu itself, I never. This is for one of you who said, "What haven't you revealed in the book?" That I was at one stage appointed as the rainmaker, as the mfondoro, and some of the stuff that I had to do, using the net to make rain, happen in Wiriyamu was in its own right an interesting story, and I think I probably at one stage should write about it. But I get some, I get sort of news from the Wiriyamu, triangle. Bear in mind the lifespan is considerably shorter, particularly of victims and survivors rather. And of late, I have not heard much. One of my students, who happens to be now a doctoral student at Stony Brook, and who is in the audience, was at one stage, a Fulbright candidate to go back to Wiriyamu and find out what was going on, what's going to be. but evidently, things have moved in a different direction. But I think there's it will be very interesting to see. I'm not so sure if I've answered that question here.
Hello, this is on? Okay. This is a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I've got two questions. The first is I was wondering if you could further situate the massacre in the context of the liberation struggle, because I don't think it's a coincidence that this happened towards the end of a very brutal, vicious anti-colonial war. So I wonder, specifically, what was the relationship between Wiriyamu and Frelimo, which is the leading organization in the national liberation struggle? I know they had created base areas in the north, liberated zones. Were there supporters in Wiriyamu? Did the Portuguese, were they right in believing that there is a link here? I mean, if you can situate this in that context. And the second is building on Alan's question. I know that the Portuguese themselves denied this, but in Mozambique itself, how widespread was the knowledge of this massacre immediately after it happened, through whispers or rumor? And did Frelimo draw attention to it and try and make propaganda value out of it, mobilize the people, or was it just silent?
Right. I addressed that in part in the Red Book, but not directly per se. In a sense, I think that Wiriyamu was tectonic in terms of its importance, to give the broader context. It fundamentally was one of the two events that brought the empire down, which was Wiriyamu, and of course it was Spinola's book, Portugal e Futuro, Portugal and the Future. And those two things really brought the 498 years of the empire on its knees. In Mozambique itself, Wiriyamu was very influential in determining the Frelimo's military strategy afterwards, but not before. In a sense, there is an argument to be made that if it hadn't, that Wiriyamu was in many respects an outcome essentially of the kind of human and social development work that the church had done in the Tete, then province, now district, or now province, then district. And the story goes up to from 1969 to 1974, and it really was very much the end product, essentially, of this, of this tussle between self-determination and Portuguese counterinsurgency that, was kill them all kind of approach to it. Was there a knowledge before it? My research of looking at the ephemera, Frelimo ephemera at the time, as opposed to afterwards in terms of, oral memorial recollection, seems to suggest that they actually didn't have a clue about it until Antonio Michone, one of the key survivors, was whisked away to be protected from the DGS, the Portuguese secret police, by a Burgos priest. I cited him, we fight, and it was he who saved it, and so in that sense, it was only afterwards that this knowledge came to the Frelimo. And incidentally, it was not because they were negligent. It's just that the logistics of warfare, of guerrilla war, is such that communications was human communications. You didn't want to have your intelligence and as you so well know. so it took that long, for them to find out. But once the story broke, not necessarily in the Times, but the following day in the BBC, that things then started heating up, and the Frelimo then knew about it. And it was Marcelino dos Santos at the UN that then capitalized on it and used this for publicity and so forth. So that's that element. There was a point, if I may say, when Marcelino dos Santos approached Peter Pringle and Hastings, Father Hastings at the UN, when they were giving, the testimony, to kind of co-opt them into the liberation narrative, and certainly Hastings was very reluctant, to side with the Frelimo at the time. I don't know about Peter, but knowing Peter as I do, and I'm in communications with him, on a regular basis, I don't think that was the case with Peter too. I mean, Peter is an extremely professional, journalist. I hope I have answered that question. Yes. Oh.
Hi. So I was interested in, so I know you were relying on different oral historiographies and different oral sources to get these survivor accounts. But I'm wondering, because, your story sort of ends with, a Portuguese state recognition of the massacre. And I'm wondering, like, where you as an Africanist historian sort of understand this unique tension that I think African histories are not stuck at, but potentially so, where, like, how do we get rid of this relation between state recognition and, like, making massacres real without sort of muddying ourselves into scenarios where you can no longer delineate what is true and what is not? I understand the importance of institutional recognition, but I guess I'm wondering, because the oral histories that you're drawing from offer us a sort of unique amount of nuance that, textual records probably clearly did not provide, it feels like this sort of coming around to state recognition, like from Portugal, it doesn't discount it, but I wonder if, like, what do we lose, I guess, when we sort of amount the significance of this massacre to state recognition, if anything. And I don't know, I'm just wondering, because I think, especially with the Africanist historian, state recognition is important, especially in, like, anti-colonial work and understanding sort of, reckoning with one's sins from the perspective of Portugal. But I don't know. Like, do you think we lose anything? I guess it's a complicated and long question.
If I understand your question is, have I muddied the waters by being on one hand a historian and on the other hand, coaxing Portugal to say, fess up, you have done it?
Well, I guess maybe, like, I don't think that that's not important, but is that where we're supposed to stop? Just because, I mean, as you had spent years working on this research, you knew that it was real. You knew that it happened. But suddenly it didn't become real for the rest of the world, or at least, like, the colonial world, until Portugal recognized it, or until the UN decided that they also thought it was real. And so, like, how as a historian, as Africanist historian, do we disassociate the relationship between real and state recognition without forgetting?
I got it. Yeah. In other words, in the face of state denial, what do you do when you know the reality of what happened? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm a great believer in in a culture of evidence and reasoned arguments. One of the, he will be unnamed official, you know, when I was doing this stuff with the Portuguese, said, yeah, you mean it was a Dhada who actually come and talked to you? He says, yes. He says, estás lixado. You are effed up, because he is going to, you know, he's going to be like an analytical woodpecker. And he's going to dig it and 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 show to you that this is A, true, and it's unjust, and you really need to examine your conscience. So the bottom line, I think, in here is the best way of losing an argument, you know, for a just cause, it's essentially to be a barbarian, to use your class as a, you know, narrative, because civility is fundamentally an act of exercising Cartesian reasoning with culture of evidence and giving unreasonable people, you know, an opportunity to find a reason. Will you succeed? No. Are you likely to succeed? Probably. Can you afford really to become a barbarian, you know, to use those technical terms and not as a value normative judgment? No, you can't. You know, let me tell you, in which I know your next question would be, perhaps I'm going to second guess it, because, you know, you're young and you really sort of ought to fight for the good cause. Yeah, I've got another 15 years of shelf life, and so basically it's 6 feet under. I mean, you know, hey, moi je m'en fous, as they say in French. But sorry, to speak. But here is something that I think, you know, you will. I'm sure you will appreciate, is that you cannot afford to compromise your transparency. You know, you're young, you only have one life to lead, and if you are a historian, you have got essentially the mantle of mindful beingness and living. That's what historians do. Culture of evidence and argument and so forth. You know, that's really the narrative that I have been trying to suggest to you. And really, at the end of the day, it's not the result that counts. It's essentially the process. If you are, you know, life is not about digits and outcomes, you know, and you know that as much as everybody else does. It's about, am I really leading a soul-centric life in which my protective skin is out of the way? You know, it's authenticity in history is something that we all strive for. And the only way in which you can get an authentic narrative, you know, is to fundamentally take the mantle of humanity's responsibility that there is nobody behind you and that you are the last Mohican. Do you get it? So it's not, and I'm not so sure if I have answered your question, but you know, false narratives will fall. I took 50, you know, it's a 50-year struggle that basically, you know, and really it's in the scheme of things, it's minor. You know, I mean, I'm just one historian, you know, who basically, and I didn't actually vilify, otherize, or anything else. Let me give you and I tell you what inspired me in the end to say, no, you are going to see sense. Here is the evidence. You are going to see sense because, you know, I've got another 15 plus years and you're going to see it. And that was the day that the reason why I chose Coimbra University was for a good reason. Because I just thought to myself, this is where the old bugger basically defined what I should be, an uncivilized under the Portuguese 1954 Colonial Act. And so when the book was published, the first thing that I did was to, you know, coax somebody to let me go and visit where he sat. Because as a historian, I wanted to contextualize essentially what I was declared not to be. And so I asked the Dean of the College of Law to let me have a look at his office. And who is this guy? And somebody said, well, he is so-and-so, and says, oh, send me his CV. And so I sent the CV, and the next thing is I get a call for an invitation to lunch. And yes, of course. And of course, the day appointed comes, and they couldn't find the keys. I said, yeah. But finally, they could find the keys. And they opened this room where this Colonial Act, you know, and other things were cooked up. And I asked the Dean, could you just leave me alone so I can actually face this moment in history, between myself and history? I mean, they were deeply reluctant, but eventually they sort of let me in. And so I shut the door. And by the way, there was this amount of dust on the chair and the table. And I opened the windows, and it was overlooking the Mondego and so forth, you know, it was a kind of... And I didn't bother to clean. I sat on the chair with the dust in it with my elbows. And the words that I actually said was, and so, was it all worth it? There was no answer, even from the depths of the unknown 6 feet under. That, to me, was effectively the moment I said, no, you are going to give me an answer, even if I die. Because that's not really what we as humans are all about. I shut the door, gave them the keys, and the Dean invited me, where would I like to go for lunch? I said, I would like to go, I go to the Quintas Lágrimas, yes, which was essentially the Castle of Tears, or the Lodge of Tears. That's where Salazar would go for lunch. And I sat exactly where he sat, and I ordered exactly what he had. Just, you know, sardines. I don't particularly care for sardines. And a glass of red, you know, I mean, and exactly the same thing. Okay, did the Dean appreciate what I did? It's probably of his head. Did I care? Was my dialogue with that? No, my dialogue was essentially with the greater moments of history that, you know, pounded inside me. So those are the things that I think, I don't know if I make any sense. You know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was touching and inspiring, and provided great insight and purpose to the life of me as a historian and many other historians in this room, and hopefully will inspire many others. But I do feel we have to close it. So thank you very much. It's 9 o'clock.